Hello, and thank you for joining this episode of DJ Shan Azure Remix. The reason you're seeing me first in the next series of videos is Matt and I actually recorded these videos in 2 longer segments. Rather than have you sit through 45 to 50 minutes of content, I thought I would structure it out so the 2 longer videos are actually 4 more snackable videos. Hopefully that makes sense. If you like what you see, please hit reshare, like, and subscribe for additional content. I've got a lot more ideas and topics to cover. Thanks. Hello, and thanks for joining another DJ Shan Azure Remix show. Today I'm joined by Matt Canty, and we're going to talk a little bit about infrastructure as code. Hi, Matt. How's it going?
I'm doing well. How about you, Miss Shannon?
I am doing well. It's been a long year and some change, but I feel like maybe we're on the brink of it turning in a positive direction.
I sure hope so.
That's what I'm telling myself anyway. So, as you know, Matt and I partnered up to talk through how do you teach an infrastructure person how to code. I've learned a lot over the course of my time of knowing Matt, and Matt's a fantastic resource to break things down. So let's talk a little bit about where did all of this start, right? So I think Matt and I have had similar situations where we've supported environments that look like this, right? Very physical environments where you've got a server per workload, something like that, right? You're connecting your cables, you're installing your operating system. If you've got a domain, you're joining a domain, you're dealing with agents, et cetera. It's kind of a manual process, right, Matt? I mean,
Yeah, not to mention opening up servers to replace memory or something of that nature
yeah,
too.
failed power supply, failed battery backups. You've got to always be conscious of the physical infrastructure that you're housing.
Air conditioning, even like including all this extra stuff, right? Who to think to take care of my server farm? I gotta call the air conditioning guy.
Right. And you want temperature monitors in your data center as well.
Sure.
Without it, you don't have any idea if there's any sort of spike in temperature, right? You need to think about all of the environmental surrounding your infrastructure that you've purchased. It's not an easy reality. And if you think about it, we evolved. We moved more virtual. We did have physical hosts as servers, but we were able to now think through virtualization. Matt, when did you first encounter a virtual server? Was it in like the early 2000s? Was it later?
Oh, let's see. It was early 2000s, I think. We started looking at VMware and things like that, and having, there back then there were some really finicky things, even with like the processor and time, and how the virtual machine picks up the time from the physical server and things like that, and having to install in patches because some VM wasn't working right because the timing was off between the physical processor and the virtual processor, and it just, yeah, I mean, yeah, this was probably 2005, maybe a little bit before that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I remember when I first pitched virtualization to the company I worked for, I used the analogy of it's kind of like riding in a carpool lane, right? The idea that you'd have one workload per server prior to virtualization. So you want to make sure that your BES is on a dedicated server, that your domain controllers are on dedicated servers. Well, virtualization allows you to sort of have multiple servers sit in kind of one car, so to speak. And I talked about the idea that it was a better use of physical servers. So we kind of graduated to that realm. It was a good graduation. I think a lot of folks realized the value of all the different layers of abstraction that we didn't have to, because the servers don't know they're not physical, but we do. And you had capacity to think about bringing on a lot of different types of workloads, and storage became an interesting conversation, sharing resources like CPU and RAM. Lots of beefier servers came out as the actual physical hosts. And I think a lot of us started moving towards scripted builds, right? Whether that be PowerShell, Bash, scripting a domain join. I don't know. Did you do a lot of that, Matt? I know that your world moved at some point from more infrastructure to development. I was just curious to know what you had seen over the course of your time in IT.
Yeah, I mean there was a lot of scripting because, half the time you would set something up and then it wasn't for, a while later that you bought new equipment and had to reset it up. So by the time you had to set up another one, sometimes you forget, what you had to go through to set up the first one. So scripting all of that out and having, this whole SOP with documentation on here's how you do it, and here's where the scripts are, and you run this, run that. Yeah, so we scripted and automated a lot of that stuff, as far as, just for the sake of being able to repeat the process.
Yeah, and I think that's the big key here is once you do something multiple times very manually, eventually you want to do it faster, and the way to do that is to lean on automation, right?
Yep, yep. And once I do it the first time anymore, I want to have it automated so I don't have to remember how to do it again. I'm getting too old for this.
That's something that I've kind of encountered as well, right? If I'm doing something and it's very time intensive, very manual, eventually I put on the Matt Canty hat, not cap. Well, I think I said cap and hat together. The Matt Canty hat, and things get a little easier because you're thinking about things from that framework of being able to automate it.
For sure.
But we can probably do better, right? And I think we have. I think what you've seen with cloud is we're getting to that point where we want to have infrastructure as code. We want to have these templates where we declare what the infrastructure looks like. We want to have your virtual network get spun up before your virtual machine gets spun up, right? Going through the idea of defining what gets provisioned. It's kind of like a recipe. That's the way I always talked about it with customers when I worked more closely with them. The idea of you've got a set of parameters that you're going to specify for a specific build that maybe lives in production or dev. And then, it's fully configured, meaning you've done things like join it to the domain. Maybe you've installed a server role on a Windows server. Maybe you've even configured an IIS website on the server, right? So I think that's a big piece that shifted and changed. I don't know. I mean, I know, of course, over the course of working at Microsoft, you've supported quite a bit of customers, and you've had to get them comfortable with this journey. What were some of the ways that you got some of the different customers more excited about embracing kind of that declarative notion of spinning up environments?
Yeah, so, when customers first start, thinking about, oh, we're going to automate something, the place where most people go is, from the past, having PowerShell or even now with newer languages thinking, oh yeah, well we can automate this in Python. You go do all these different things with scripting and spell out the steps that it's going to take to do this. And it's funny and exciting to see how customers react when you show them, hey, I got this thing here, and it deploys this whole environment, and you don't have to tell it, deploy this first and then deploy this second and deploy this third. I mean, you do, but you do it in such a way that it is not, you know, building out step by step and having to know what order something happens, within the script, and then having to go back and say, oh yeah, well we forgot to do this part here, and now we have to go find where in the script that we put that part in. And heaven forbid we're doing some sort of looping or something like that in the script where it's going
Right.
to affect something else. Now we have to redefine our whole entire loop because, we've injected something in there that has to be, in a specific order, but not necessarily happening as part of that loop. So now we're splitting things up. And when you show them, how this can happen with just a declarative kind of configuration, really is what I would call it. This is a configuration that you're passing into a service that's going to look at that configuration and say, oh, this is what you want and this is what you want it to look like. I'm going to make it that way, right?
Yeah.
So it makes it a lot less kind of spaghetti brain. You don't have to peel the layers apart, layer after layer after layer, to figure out where am I going to put this and how am I going to split this up in order to fit another step in the process, or something into the process where it's going to have to happen in a specific order.
Yeah. And I think something we'll touch on during a later session is the idea of nested templates, parent child templates. thinking through kind of that collaborative development, whereas you don't have to be the wizard of everything. You could be the wizard of the one thing that you understand and know, and it could be part of a larger deployment that fully configures all of the VMs in whatever application set you're trying to spin up too, right? So I feel like the power of ARM templates, or at least a templated deployment, doesn't always have to be ARM templates, right? I feel like that's a big win here related to the cloud and embracing the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, with nested templates and child templates, when it helps you do what us developers like to call decoupling things from each other, right? So I can say, hey, I have this VM template and it deploys a VM in this manner. What if I need to swap that out? And instead of, hey, deploying a VM, I need to deploy web apps, some sort of PaaS service. I mean, I can just say, hey, let's swap this out with a PaaS service template, put that in our main template, you know, you put in all the parameters that are needed for the platform as a service piece versus the virtual machine or the virtual machine scale set, swap those parameters out and bada bing, bada boom, you're done. You've just changed out your infrastructure by changing, one piece. And that's why it helps with having nested templates with children that support the different services that you're deploying, because then if you wanted to take advantage of a new feature or something like that, you only go, you go into this one template here. I don't have to search through 500 lines of code or 1,000 lines of code in one template to find out, okay, where is this at and how many different things are affecting the values that are being plugged in here. I have all these parameters and variables and things like that, and we'll talk about those in future videos. But they're affecting all of the lines of code in here, and so when you start decoupling your templates and and managing those templates separately, then if you need to put together a new environment, say I'm going from, I'm deploying these two domain controllers to, now I need to deploy two web servers, or I need to add web servers to my two domain controller deployments, then I have all the pieces there and I just change my main template to piece the pieces together that I need.
Yeah, I think of it like hot swappable, right? Like if we want to go back to the true infrastructure talk where we're handling our own infrastructure, it's very much so kind of like a hot swappable sort of thing. Like you can drag out what you need, plug in a replacement template, and maybe you have to troubleshoot it ever so slightly, but I think breaking it apart definitely makes it a little easier. You don't have a ridiculously long template. You've got a template that's got a nested template that it calls, but the nested template's smaller. To me, it's easier to troubleshoot too if you're trying to figure out what's not working versus, 1,000 line template.
For sure, and even then, if you run into these frustrating scenarios where you're trying to domain join something, right? I think we actually were working through a template together where we were thinking, oh, should we do this with the domain join extension or should we do this with DSC? And when you have that template as just a sub template, it's easy to just swap that out, right? You just go into your template and say, oh, well, it's not working right, or we can't figure out, the documentation's not good, heaven forbid, and so we can just swap this out and do it this other way instead, and it's just a swap of that sub template instead of again having to go into this large monolithic thing and figure out where to make changes, and hopefully that doesn't break everything else.
Yeah. So that brings us to infrastructure as code. So I'll just read this actual definition that comes from Wikipedia. Infrastructure as code is the process of managing and provisioning computer data centers through machine readable definition files rather than physical hardware configuration or interactive configuration tools. The definitions may be stored in a version control system. So, I mean, if I were to think about that, right, and I've gotten more comfortable with source control, and we'll talk about source control at a future session as well, just because of the fact it was super foreign to me. The idea of I kind of am a developer. I'm committing code to a repository that I'm going to pull from down the road to redeploy whatever environment I need to redeploy. I mean, this was a huge change for me trying to just understand the fact that we could go from clicking next, 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 to having a fully automated deployment that will factor in all of the next that you would just manually click through to spin up an environment. I don't know. This kind of blew my world a little bit. I think my mind sort of melted, maybe even exploded a bit, thinking about the fact that I didn't have to sit there. I mean, granted, I had to get my environment ready to be built correctly, right? I mean, I didn't have it ready to go out the gate. But once I spent time inside of ARM templates, asking you questions, playing around, understanding the errors, understanding the ways to build things so that I don't have errors, right? It was a crazy reality to come to that point of everything's faster, everything's more efficient, and I have more time to learn a lot of other things that I didn't realize I even had time to do because I was so used to this clicking next, next, next sort of thing, right?
Right, babysitting, yeah,
Yep.
clicking next, reading, making sure that the Google toolbar is not part of that next process, right?
Right. Right, that you can actually get to that point where you've got your full configuration in a file that you can store on a version control system, whether it be on GitHub, whether it be Azure DevOps Server, Azure DevOps as it stands, any of the Bitbucket products, right? I think just mostly it's just Bitbucket, I believe, but I feel like even that product line has changed quite a bit. So, and I think the interesting part here too is when I worked with customers, Matt, I think we've talked about this, the idea that the network virtual appliances or the NVAs, the major vendors, they don't really have a backup utility. They have
Well,
instead a lot of code committed to their GitHub repos,
yep,
and it's community driven. So the idea is you'll take that and you'll have it ready to go and you'll store it in your own source control. So if something happens to your NVA, it's a matter of redeploying it via
yep,
code.
yep, and it's minutes, right? It
Yeah,
takes minutes, and a lot of that time is just depending on how long it takes to provision the computer from the image that it's using, right?
yeah, correct. Correct. Which is just so crazy to me that there's no like the actual pattern, and it's not just any, it seems to be every NVA vendor that I've seen. So Palo Alto,
Yep.
F5, they all recommend going to their GitHub repo to spin things up because it's actually faster than a backup and a restore, which also kind of blew my mind thinking about it. Like we're going from the notion of, and to me, it was a little bit of an anti-pattern at first because I'm used to backing up and restoring things. That's what I've been doing my entire tech career. All of a sudden, we're moving from the idea of have all of your base configurations stored in source control and then redeploy from the source control. I was like, what? I felt like we went to like a different level in time. It was like, wow, we've really changed that dynamic so significantly.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, think about it. If what you're deploying is this thing that's running this code with this configuration, and it's not really storing any sort of data locally other than the configuration, right? Then why not just start from the configuration that is being deployed, right? Like let's say you deployed this thing and somebody was in there tinkering around with stuff, checking out some settings or whatever, and host something, right? Everything's not working. Traffic, is not routing the way it's supposed to, or it's being filtered out or blocked or something of that nature. And you don't know. And this guy that did this thing, mess around with 5, 10 different settings in there, and we don't know which one it is and what settings affect what, right? So we can just go in and redeploy this thing that we know is the base configuration that we've deployed before, and bam, it's back to normal within.
I know, which is so crazy, so crazy. So we've gone through this weird evolutionary phase. And if you think about it, so infrastructure as code is an approach to infrastructure automation based software development practices. So I joke very often that I am not a software developer. I never did it professionally prior to my time at Microsoft. And even now, I don't even claim to be a software developer. If anything, I might be an infrastructure developer, but I often tell people that I just play a dev on TV. So if you want me to do code reviews, I'm not your person. Go find Matt on social media. We'll include all of his great links to get a hold of him if you've ever got questions. But I mean, I would very much so just break down and say I've got to bring an actual dev in to go through a code review, right? So infrastructure as code emphasizes consistent and repeatable routines. It allows for the fast provisioning that we've talked about, quick system changes, et cetera. All of that is really an interesting paradigm shift. We've gone from everything being more manual, all of these outages being a little longer, to a very quick turnaround to have an environment back up and functional. So, changes are made to definition files and then rolled out to systems through automatic and unattended processes. You can also think about testing and validation, right? The idea of being able to put all of this into a CI/CD pipeline. So continuous improvement, continuous delivery. You
Yes.
don't even have to deploy it. You can configure a tool to go redeploy it for you, which I'm like, wait, what? What?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Very
here's what I tell customers about having infrastructure as code as well is you have developers that are developing code to run on this infrastructure, right? So they're sitting down, writing this code, and they're storing it in source control. And that code is going to run on a specific set of infrastructure. Now, once version 2 comes out, they might be adding a service. Say they're now wanting to do some sort of event-based uh, feature in their application where they're firing off an event to say some sort of queue or event hub or something like that. Now they need another piece of infrastructure. So the code, begets these infrastructure changes. And when you store your infrastructure as code in your repository alongside of the code that it supports, then if you were, say, in version 20 and you found, oh, we have this bug in the software and we didn't realize this was here, does this go back to version 15, right? And so I want to go deploy version 15. Well, if you are keeping your infrastructure as code versioned at the same version as your application, you can tell your CI/CD pipeline, I want to deploy version 15, and boom, all the infrastructure goes out there. All of the code goes out there to that infrastructure, and you have version 15 as it was, infrastructure configuration too. We can talk about desired state configuration or Chef or Puppet or Ansible or those things, and the infrastructure. So you infrastructure, the configuration, and the code all in one place to that specific version of the application, and I can deploy that within minutes, depending on how big my infrastructure is that I'm deploying and what are my
No.
details, right?
And it's just so crazy. So we've gone from, it taking potentially months, hopefully not years, but there were some longer upgrades that took a very long period of time in my prior life to cloud, right? But we've gone from months to weeks to days to minutes, maybe even seconds, depending upon what you're deploying, right? Things are pretty fast. And I think the big piece here is that infrastructure as code allows you to take things to kind of that next level. And there's great things we'll be sharing with you throughout this entire series. And I think the big piece here is you don't have to start from scratch unless you really want to, unless you're a glutton for punishment. You don't have to start from scratch. And I think that was the big piece for me. I felt like learning ARM templates and learning how to code some of what I did in my daily job, it felt a little foreign at first. But when I had people like Matt who would explain the areas where I get stuck, or I had a bunch of repos that exist out in the kind of broader community to kind of start from, I felt a little less anxious.
The community is huge, and we'll definitely share some links and resources, especially that I use as far as when I'm developing infrastructure as code. And the community is a huge help. And I usually tell customers this as well, is that probably 80% of what you want to do has been done already. So go find it in the community, pull it down. You need to understand what it does so that you know what parts that you need to remove, what parts that you need to add. But I mean, you can get 80% of the work done without even, typing a key on the keyboard.
Yep, I completely agree. I completely agree.